Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, and welcome back as we continue with the Philosophy and Fiction of C.S. Lewis, which is a course that I ran in the summer of 2024. This time we'll be continuing with That Hideous Strength with chapters 7 through 11. Now, when I first led this course live, I interspersed the abolition of man here throughout our That Hideous Strength study. But I think for doing it in this format, I'm going to change that a little bit. And we're just going to do the mid part of That Hideous Strength now, do the final part next week, and then after that, we'll do abolition of man separately once we finish That Hideous Strength. Now, before we get going, as a reminder, we do have two other podcasts that I encourage you to listen to. We have Mythic Mind Games, where we take a Christian humanities approach to video games. We just started a Final Fantasy series over there, so that should be good. And then we also have Mythic Mind Movies and Shows, where we do the same kind of thing, but with movies and shows. Right now, we're in the midst of a Star Wars series. So I encourage you to check those out, or become a patron over at patreon.com. Any level of support will give you full access to the Discord, but also all three of those podcasts delivered into one feed, early and ad-free. So again, patreon.com/mythicmind. But now let's go ahead and get into it today with That Hideous Strength, chapters 7 through 11. Oh, and one more thing. Stay tuned for the very end as I provide you with a new overview of the upcoming Elder Scrolls and Philosophy course. You can also watch that if you're over on YouTube. And by the way, if you don't already know this, all these episodes are being put onto YouTube, and so you want to watch the video for that, see the PowerPoints and whatnot, then just click that link in the show notes and go and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and that way you have both formats available to you. All right, well now let's go ahead and get to it. Welcome back as we settle in for That Hideous Strength, Part 2, looking at chapters 7 through 11. Now, I did get some comments that sometimes the background's a little too busy, makes it difficult to see the text, and so went with a fairly plain background today. Hopefully that's going to be helpful for you. Now, just like in this entire book, there's a lot going on in these chapters, and that's because things are really starting to come to a head. In fact, actually, I think this is chapter 13, so a little bit after this section. Dimple says something I think is going to be helpful for setting our expectations for the book from this point forward. Dimple says, "Good is always getting better, and bad is always getting worse. The possibilities of even apparent neutrality are always diminishing. The whole thing is sorting itself out all the time, coming to a point, getting sharper and harder." And this is a theme that we've already seen, that we've seen in some of Lewis's other writings up to this point, but that we're really going to see as we move toward the end of That Hideous Strength. At the end of reality, you have the fullness of reality which is found in heaven. As Lewis is going to tell us in The Great Divorce, that heaven is what remains when everything is shaken, because that is the most solid reality, the most real reality, as it is the dwelling place of God, the only truly stable, independent reality in whose essence we find existence itself. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have hell, which is as close as you can get to non-being while still existing. And so it's really on the edge of being. It's kind of falling off into nothingness. It's falling off into the void, right on the edge of existence there. And every movement that we make is ultimately moving us in one direction or the other. And so this is why, again, I'm probably referencing The Great Divorce a little bit more than I should at this point, since we haven't gotten to it yet. But in The Great Divorce, Lewis makes the point that heaven has a way of working its way backwards into our actions today, even if we don't see that, just as hell works itself backwards as well. And so what seems like our daily decisions, our daily relationships, our daily virtues and vices really have eternal significance. In fact, it is the eternal meeting with us in the present. And so as we move toward the end of That Hideous Strength, what we're going to see is the bad guys get worse, or at least the extent of their evil becomes increasingly revealed, just as the goodness of the good guys becomes increasingly revealed or solidified. We see that Mark and Jane, who are our chief actors in this story, are going to be brought to a point of decision, a point in which their eternal states are going to start to more clearly manifest themselves in their particular present decisions. And so, with that in mind, we are going to cover all these chapters, 7 through 11, but we're mostly going to focus, or at least we're going to give a disproportionate amount of time to the beginning and the end as we look at Jane's transformation and the beginning of Mark's transformation. And so, let's start with Jane's interaction with the director. And I should emphasize this parallelism that we've seen from the beginning, that Jane and Mark are moving in very similar paths, even though they're going in different directions. Jane, throughout the story, is increasingly being pulled up. Yes, she has some obstacles to overcome, and sometimes she wavers, but overall she is moving on an upward track toward the heavenly, whereas Mark is moving increasingly toward the hellish. He is losing his identity as Jane is increasingly finding her identity. Mark is being increasingly consumed by the NICE, and more particularly by Wither, who himself is ultimately consumed by the devil. And then you have Jane, who's increasingly being invited further up and further into the true inner circle. She is moving toward the true center of things as she moves further and further into the fulfillment of her destiny, not only in relation to Venus, but even more so in relation to Ransom, to Jupiter, to Christ, to Meldal. And so she is being made more herself as Mark is increasingly losing himself. Now, these paths that they're walking take marked turns. They can enter into a new level through their interactions with the respective heads at play. And so it's very intentional that Lewis sets this up here, where Jane is meeting with the head of St. Anne's, of the company at St. Anne's, just as Mark is meeting with the head of the NICE. And so through their interactions with the respective heads, they're going to have very different sensations. They're going to have very different responses. Mark, at least for a time, is going to become more solidified in the allegiance to that head and all that that entails, and then Jane is going to grow in an allegiance to the head of St. Anne's, which is Ransom. And of course, in giving allegiance to these respective heads, they're really giving allegiance to the forces behind the heads, because we're going to see that both Ransom as well as the head of the NICE, both of them serve a priestly role. Both of them are bridges to higher or lower realities, toward the hierarchy versus the lowerarchy, to borrow a term from Screwtape. But first, let's take a look at Jane and her interactions with Ransom. So Miss Ironwood tells Jane that Ransom is wounded, which we know that comes from the wound that he gained from the Unman on Paralandra, as he crushed the head of the serpent, which in turn wounded his heel. And so this is a wound that he carries with him. And that's because Ransom has not yet entered into his glory. And so he still bears wounds from this conflict. And that's something that's going to come up a little bit later on. But for now, let's go ahead and read this passage. In fact, we're going to read a few long passages just because I think that they're so important in setting the moods and bringing us where Lewis wants to bring us. And so when Jane met with the director, it says that Jane looked, and instantly her world was unmade. On a sofa before her, with 1 foot bandaged as if he had a wound, lay what appeared to be a boy, 20 years old. On one of the long windowsills, a tame jackdaw was walking up and down. The light of the fire with its weak reflection, and the light of the sun with its stronger reflection, contended on the ceiling. But all the light in the room seemed to run toward the gold hair and gold beard of the wounded man. Of course, he was not a boy. How could she have thought so? The fresh skin on his forehead and cheeks, and, above all, on his hands, had suggested the idea. But no boy could have so full a beard, and no boy could be so strong. She had expected to see an invalid. Now it was manifest that the grip of those hands would be inescapable, and imagination suggested that those arms and shoulders could support the whole house. this ransom, the ransom of that hideous strength, is obviously a very different ransom than we get in Out of the Silent Planet and even Paralandra. It's been said before that ransom of Out of the Silent Planet is like J.R.R. Tolkien, but by the time we get to that hideous strength, he moves into a Charles Williams persona. But I'm actually more interested in looking at the in-story developments here. And so in Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom gains his correct relationship to the martial influence. And as an emissary of Mars, as an incarnation of the martial influence, Ransom is sent to Paralandra. And that's part of the masculine role, in that he asserts himself and that he moves into Paralandra in a way so that he can use his strength through sacrificial service in order to secure her virtue and allow Paralandra, allow Venus, to be more of herself. Through this right relationship of the masculine and the feminine, new life is brought forward. And as Mars and Venus are rightly related, they participate in this grand cosmic dance that raises them up further up and further in, because as they have right order with themselves, they come into harmony with that which orders, namely the influence of Jupiter, which is connected to Christ. And remember your Gospel of John, that Christ is the Logos, in whom, through whom all things were created. And as Paul tells us, in him all things are held together. And so he is the order of the cosmos. And even that word logos, which I've talked about, I think back in the introduction to the course, that word logos, or it gets translated as word, is obviously where we get the word logic, but it goes beyond that. The ancient Greeks referred to the logos as that ultimate ordering principle. And that's because logos, which is translated as word, is that which gives form to otherwise cacophonous, discordant sounds. You empty out a Scrabble bag and you just have random letters. Well, that doesn't actually mean anything. It only has the potential of meaning. But in order to actually have meaning, what you need is the form of a word imposed on those letters. So now the otherwise cacophonous, discordant, meaningless sounds are now brought together into coherent meaning through the right form. And this is what a word does. It gives form. It is the foundation of intelligible meaning. And so the logos is the ordering principle. And so it's not a coincidence that Christ, the Logos, became associated with Jupiter, the king of the planets, who is in charge of making sure that everything is operating in the right manner. And so, through the right relationship, through the right ordering of Venus and Mars, we rise up in reality toward that which orders, which namely is Jupiter. And so, we have a dialectic here. In Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom gets the right relationship to Mars, and then in Paralandra, that extends to the right relationship between Mars and Venus, and through that right relationship, Ransom gains a correct relationship to Jupiter, which ultimately is that which orders, that which is orchestrating all of these things. And we got hints of that in Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra, but now we see that fulfillment. And so at this point, Ransom is a stand-in or an avatar, representative, I guess is perhaps the best word. Or actually, no, better yet, he is a bridge, right? He is a priest. He is a bridge between the influence of Jupiter and the chaotic influence of the Silent Planet. And so he is going to be an instantiation of order amidst chaos. He is that bridge between deep heaven and earth. And this is that theme that we've seen developing from the very beginning. Remember in Out of the Silent Planet, where Ransom has that dream in which he is sitting on that wall with 1 foot in the darkness, 1 foot in the garden. And then in Paralandra, we get this piebald imagery as he is pale on one side and sunburned on the other side. Ransom has always been moving into this role as bridge between deep heaven and earth. And we get other cosmic imagery here as well. And so he's connected with the sun. And so compared to Ransom, the light of the fire is a weak reflection. And because Ransom has this solar influence, which remember is the influence of reason, which shows us that he has penetrating insight. And also we're told that he is simultaneously young and old, or at least he has the appearance of being both young and the sensation of being old. And this speaks to the fact that he is being linked to the eternal, which is infinitely ancient, but also infinitely present. It is both old and new at the same time. And so we have all of these connotations being wrapped up here in the imagery, that he is connected with Jupiter, he's connected with the sun, he's connected with eternality, but he's also hyper present in his current situation. And I just realized I'm not actually showing the slideshow, so let's do that. Okay, and then we get some more imagery here regarding the sensations that Jane is feeling. It says, how could she have thought him young, or old either? It came over her with a sensation of quick fear that this face was of no age at all. She had, or so she had believed, disliked bearded faces, except for old men with white hair, but that was because she had long since forgotten the imagined Arthur of her childhood, and the imagined Solomon too. Solomon, for the first time in many years, the bright solar blend of king and lover and magician which hangs about that name, stole back upon her mind. For the first time in all those years, she tasted the word king itself, with all linked associations of battle, marriage, priesthood, mercy, and power. At that moment, as her eyes first rested on his face, Jane forgot who she was, and where, and her faint grudge against Grace Ironwood, and her more obscure grudge against Mark, in her childhood and her father's house. It was, of course, only for a flash. Next moment, she was once more the ordinary social Jane, flushed and confused to find that she had been staring rudely, at least she had hoped that rudeness would be the main impression produced, at a total stranger. But her world was unmade. She knew that. Anything might happen now. And so what we have here is that Jane, in her progression toward the right relationship with Venus, as well as that which stands above Venus, she is coming into confrontation with the masculine, in a sense that she never has before, and certainly not in Mark. And so she's experiencing battle, marriage, priesthood, mercy, and power. She's getting all these images in mind. And I think it's worth noting that Lewis says that the way that he writes stories is that first he would get these images in his mind, and then he would find the right form for those images, and that's how his stories developed. And so, when he's writing Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, he said that what he didn't do was, ask what image would portray Christ. No, what he had in his mind was the image of a fawn and a light post. He had an image of a great lion. And then out of those images, the story developed. And I think that's kind of what's happening here. That before Jane can actually hear the words that Ransom is saying, she begins with images, with impressions. And that's because images, impressions, in many ways are more real than words. In fact, I'm going to refer to a quote just a little bit from Paralandra that says something to that effect, that experiences, real experiences, are more concrete than words. This goes back to the meditation in a tool shed, that it is a different experience. It is a more real experience to look along the light beam in order to understand the light beam than it is to stand outside the light beam and simply to study it objectively. That looking along is more real than looking at, even though looking at very well may have its place. Because as soon as you stop looking along the light beam, or even if you are looking along the light beam, but then you just start thinking about the light beam, then you're no longer actually experiencing what the light beam is. And what the light beam is illumination, that you can see other realities by that illumination. And so when you lose that telos of the light beam, then you're no longer actually experiencing the light beam. And so what we have here is that Jane is not just immersed in conversation. At first, remember, she can't even hear the words that Ransom is saying. What she's doing is she's experiencing the moment. She's experiencing everything that Ransom stands for in this moment. She is experiencing battle, marriage, priesthood, mercy, and power. And she is just undone. In fact, it just says that here. Her world was unmade. She knew that. Anything might happen now. And so in the presence of Ransom and everything that he is a conduit for, she just falls apart and she is going to be built up anew. This is very much a kind of conversion experience here, even though she'll have to figure out how to relate to it. Okay, and so we continue to get some imagery here, and the voice also seemed to be like sunlight and gold. Like gold, not only as gold is beautiful, but as it is heavy. Like sunlight, not only as it falls gently on English walls in autumn, but as it beats down on the jungle or the desert to engender life or destroy it. and now it was addressing her. And so now she's being addressed by the solar influence as it's working its way through Ransom. It is beautiful. It is drawing her in. It is connected to gold. And remember, the solar influence is responsible for reason, and so he has penetrating insight that can dispel the darkness, and it will dispel the darkness of confusion, the darkness of false appearances, the darkness of artificial constructs of personality and fake excuses. It's going to see through all of that, and it's going to force Jane into the light. It's going to force her to come into confrontation with the truth. It's going to force her to come into confrontation with reality. And this is why it is the same sunlight that falls gently on English walls, as well as the sunlight that bears down on the jungle or the desert to engender life or to destroy it. And she is going to be undone, but that's exactly what we need in order to be done, to be built up in the correct way. We're going to see Mark is going to encounter a very different experience, even though he's looking in a very different direction, or rather, he has a very different setting that triggers this reaction, where he too will be undone so that he can be rebuilt. Okay, and I'm not going to read this passage, but again, same kinds of things at play, similar imagery. We get that every gesture was printing itself on her memory, and so she is experiencing imagery rather than hearing words. And then here's that quotation from Paralandra that I mentioned, in which the Lewis character is talking to Ransom about his experiences on Paralandra, and it says, "I was questioning him on the subject, which he doesn't often allow, and had incautiously said, 'Of course I realize it's all rather too vague for you to put into words,' when he took me up rather sharply for such a patient man by saying, 'On the contrary, it is words that are vague. The reason why the thing can't be expressed is that it is too definite for language.'" And so this is why Jane could not hear Ransom at first. What she was experiencing was too definite. And so this is a strong contrast to all of the lack of definition that we find at Belbury, as nobody really says what they mean. Everything is vague. Everything's clouded. Mark very rarely actually knows what's going on because nobody speaks clearly. But here, in the light of the solar influence, with the weight of Jupiter, we get something that is so concrete that, unlike Mark, there's no time to focus on the words being said because the thing itself is here. And now we move into some of the dialogue, some of the solar dialogue. And Jane's trying to figure out what to do here. I mean, she wants to stay with the company of St. Anne's, even if Mark isn't involved. And Ransom and the company have already made it very clear that they really want Mark involved. They don't want to take Jane on her own. And so she says, "I must do what I think is right, mustn't I?" she said softly. "I mean, if my husband, is on the wrong side, I can't let that make any difference to what I do, can I?" And the director says, "You are thinking about what is right?" Jane started and flushed. She had not, she realized, been thinking about that. And so she makes it sound like she's worried about what is right, but she's really not thinking in those terms at all. And so she is trying to present herself as more noble, as more virtuous, as more concerned with the truth than she actually is. What she knows is that she is afraid. She knows that she wants to be with Ransom. She wants to be with the company of St. Anne's, but she's not necessarily thinking in terms of true and false at this point, of the right course of action and the wrong course of action. She hasn't yet had that kind of moral conversion, but she's acting like she has. And so, with this solar influence, this confusion that she's trying to put forward is being dismissed. The fog is being penetrated. She's not allowed to hide. The solar influence is making her give an account for the reasoning that she actually has. And so this fake reasoning, this faux reasoning is being dispelled by the solar influence. So then she responds with something that's more authentic to where she currently is. And she starts questioning the view on marriage that's being put forward by Ransom and by his masters. And she says, don't they care about my situation, right? Don't they know I'm not happy? And so she's implying that surely if they really knew how cold, how destitute their marriage was, they wouldn't put so much stock in it. And Ransom responds, "Child," said the director, "it is not a question of how you or I look on marriage, but how my masters look on it." Someone said they're very old-fashioned, but that was a joke. They are not old-fashioned, but they are very, very old. They would never think of finding out first whether Mark and I believed in their ideas of marriage. Well, no, said the director with a curious smile. No, quite definitely. They wouldn't think of doing that. And so what we see here is a hierarchy model of truth. Truth is what really exists above and beyond us, and it is passed down. Truth is not democratic. It is not something that we create. It is not something that we vote on. It is not something, first and foremost, that arises out of our context. Truth is that which we must contextualize ourselves into. Or rather, we need to recognize that it is already the context in which we live and move and have our being. And this connects to some of what Screwtape told us about democracy, right? We want everything to be democratic. We want everything to be from the ground up. But the problem is, when we make everything from the ground up, well then there's actually no ground to be had because, well, we don't get to create the ground. That the idea of democracy only makes sense if you believe that there is such a thing as human nature, if you believe that there is such a thing as rights, if you do believe that there is such a thing as the dignity of the individual, and all of these things have to come from above, or they're just artificial constructs, and the very idea of democracy falls apart, whether we're talking about in politics or anything else. And there's another essay from Present Concerns called Democratic Education, and I think that this quote here is relevant. Lewis says, "Beauty is not democratic. She reveals herself more to the few than to the many, more to the persistent and disciplined seekers than to the careless. Virtue is not democratic. She is achieved by those who pursue her more hotly than most men. Truth is not democratic. She demands special talents and special industry in those to whom she gives her favors. Political democracy is doomed if it tries to extend its demand for equality into these higher spheres. Ethical, intellectual, or aesthetic democracy is death." And so what Jane is going to have to learn is that it doesn't really matter what she thinks. It doesn't really matter what she feels. Reality does not bend to her will. That's the path of the magician. That's the path of the sorcerer. That's the path of the NICE. But what she needs to do is learn how to obey. She needs to learn how to submit. And in submission, she will find freedom. In bowing her will toward that which is above, her will actually become more free. Her thoughts, her beliefs will actually gain some context. But as she's just continuing to be undone, she's struggling to find the right words to even articulate what she's thinking. And so Jane was silent, though she could not tell the director the truth, and indeed did not know it herself. Yet when she tried to explore her inarticulate grievance against Mark, a novel sense of her own injustice, and even of pity for her husband, arose in her mind. And so this is where we see that transformation starting to take place. And so she is still dealing with inarticulate images and sensations. But that sensation is now moving from recognizing Ransom in his strength, in his glory, in his penetrating solar influence, in his Malacandrian martial spirit, in his jovial kingship, and in response to masculinity as such, she is now starting to develop a healthy relationship or a healthy sentiment toward her husband, even though this is still at the very beginning. The seed has been planted, and it will continue to grow and eventually lead to the kind of life that Jane was always meant to hold. But this begins as pity, as sympathy for Mark, which she did not have at the beginning of the story. Remember, she initially saw herself as a victim, but now she's starting to see Mark as that which she is to love. "It was not his fault," she said at last. "I suppose our marriage was just a mistake." The director said nothing. What would the people you were talking of say about a case like that?" "I will tell you, if you really want to know," said the director. "Please," said Jane reluctantly. "They would say," he answered, "that you do not fail in obedience through lack of love, but have lost love because you never attempted obedience." That right there is a powerful line. With this, Ransom really dispels this vapid understanding of love as mere emotion, of self-centeredness, that asks, does this person make me feel happy? Does this person make me feel fulfilled? And if those are your questions for understanding what love is, then you don't understand what love is. Because love is not about you. Love is about giving yourself away toward that which you decide to love. That's what love is. It's about giving yourself away toward that which you decide to love. In fact, better yet, true love is giving yourself away to that which truly merits your love, that which deserves your love, that to whom your love is owed. And so she, even during this conversation, has been trying to move things back to herself in a self-referential manner. Surely these powers at play here, wouldn't want to bulldoze over my understanding of marriage. Surely these powers at play here would have a different stance if they really knew what I was going through. And so she's still trying to contextualize everything within her own little sphere. But that's exactly what made this planet silent. The fact that it was trying to contextualize everything within itself. That's where we get Lewis's idea of hell as radical isolation. It's all about contextualizing everything within yourself. Ransom says, no, if you want to know love, then you need to contextualize yourself within a greater reality. You need to learn obedience. You cannot stand until you first learn how to kneel. And so this is what Jane's starting to learn, learning how to give herself over in love toward a greater context, beginning with the context of her marriage to Mark. And this theme continues throughout this conversation as Jane says, I thought equality, especially in marriage, was the most important thing here. And Ransom says, no, not at all. Because if you make equality the most important thing, then you actually lose any ground for even calling equality good. And this is what we see in Screwtape, that Screwtape is constantly trying to establish disordered loves, where we take even good things like justice and raise that to the ultimate. And by in so doing, we actually lose the good that makes justice good. And in so doing, we turn justice into a fault, into a realm of vice, despite the fact that rightly ordered, it is a realm of virtue. And so Ransom says that, we need a kind of political equality on the surface in order to prevent oppression. However, underneath that outer garb of political equality, we need a kind of hierarchy. We need an inequality. The male and the female need to embody different qualities. They need to have a particular relationship. They are not the same. When we try to make them the same, we're actually going to lose what makes them glorious. We're going to lose that right relating between Mars and Venus. And when we lose that right relationship between Mars and Venus, we also lose the right relationship with Jupiter. This is where things fall apart into disorder, into chaos. Throughout the series so far, Lewis has building within us a strong sense of hierarchy. That when we maintain proper relationships with our immediate surroundings, we rise up in the great dance to the next level. And this allows us to engage in a greater degree of order. And as that order continues to manifest itself, we go further up and further into even greater order. And so it rises up from the particular up to the ideal. But when we get the particular wrong, we're going to get the ideal wrong. And so we're always moving upward toward increased order in the grand hierarchy that finds its ultimate point in God himself, or we're moving increasingly in disorder down to the realm of hell, where things are utterly inverted. And so despite the fact that Lewis maintains and Ransom maintains we need a kind of political equality to prevent oppression, he says that underneath that political reality, we need inequality. And not necessarily inequality of value, but just inequality of function. In his essay, Equality, he says, when equality is treated not as a medicine or a safety gadget, but as an ideal, we begin to breed that stunted and envious sort of mind which hates all superiority. That mind is the special disease of democracy, as cruelty and servility are the special diseases of privileged societies. It will kill us all if it grows unchecked. The man who cannot conceive a joyful and loyal obedience on the one hand, nor an embarrassed and noble acceptance of that obedience on the other, the man who has never even wanted to kneel or to bow, is a prosaic barbarian. But it would be wicked folly to restore these old inequalities on the legal or external plane. Their proper place is elsewhere. I can go ahead and read this next passage. We must wear clothes since the fall. Yes, but inside, under what Milton called these troublesome disguises, we want the naked body, that is, the real body, to be alive. We want it on proper occasions to appear, in the marriage chamber, in the public privacy of men's bathing place, and, of course, when any medical or other emergency demands. In the same way, under the necessary outer covering of legal equality, the whole hierarchical dance and harmony of our deep and joyously accepted spiritual inequalities should be alive. It is there, of course, in our life as Christians. There, as laymen, we can obey, all the more because the priest has no authority over us on the political level. It is there in our relation to parents and teachers, all the more because it is now a willed and holy spiritual reverence. It should be there also in marriage. And so what Lewis wants to do here, what Ransom wants to do, is to remove the element of legal or institutional coercion. He wants to remove compulsion. And what he wants is a free will participation in the dance. And that dance requires a hierarchy. When you are dancing with somebody, you need somebody to lead and you need somebody to follow. If both are leading, then things are going to fall apart. But if you have the right relationship in the dance, what you get is something harmonious. You get something beautiful. You get something deeply joyous. And I think that this is a good nuanced position here, in that he recognizes that, yes, we need to stem oppression, we need to stem tyranny, and so we need some kind of legal equality. But that legal equality is a safety gadget, as he says. It's not reality. If we're going to be real, then what we need is the right kind of hierarchy. We need the right relationship between Mars and Venus that brings us up toward Jupiter. We need the embodied submission to the priest. We need the embodied submission to parents and teachers. We need the embodied submission in marriage. Otherwise, the dance is going to fall apart. And this continues this theme we see from Screwtape as well as already in the Ransom series, and especially in this conversation that we're looking at in That Hideous Strength, that Lewis, on one hand, he says that he believes in democracy in a legal sense, but not because everybody's equal. He says he holds to democracy because everybody's sinful, and he doesn't believe that anybody is well established to rule over everybody else. And so legally, politically speaking, he is pro-democracy, but that's because not people are so good and have this dignity about them, but actually because people are so bad. But he says that when you get under the political sphere, which exists as a safety guard, when you get to reality, real life, there needs to be this kind of hierarchy. Because if we don't have that hierarchy, then we actually lose the very place of meaning. Things fall apart into disorder, things fall apart into chaos, things fall apart into hell. And so we can't mistake the political safety guard for the metaphysical reality. And so, I see, said the director, it is not your fault. They never warned you. No one has ever told you that obedience, humility, is an erotic necessity. You are putting equality just where it ought not to be. And then at this point in the conversation, the focus has really been on his solar influence, but the jovial influence is going to start to take a more marked role here. And so I want to provide this quote from Christina Hale in Deeper Heaven. She says that Ransom has become a Christ figure, priest king. One of his primary jobs is to bring about the reunion of Mark and Jane Studdock and the restoration of their marriage. If we paid close attention to the role that Jove plays throughout the trilogy and Lewis's other works, this won't surprise us. Bridging and binding, joining together, connecting and holding, these are all things accomplished by Jove. And so, as Ransom, the priest king, is bringing about the reunion of Mark and Jane, he is doing on a particular earthly level that which Jupiter does on the cosmic level. And here we go. Here's the jovial influence shining through. Hugeness was what she was thinking of, and for one moment it had seemed she was thinking of her own hugeness in comparison with the mice, but almost at once this identification collapsed. She was really thinking simply of hugeness. Or rather, she was not thinking of it. There's a typo in this ebook that I copied from. Anyways, she was in some strange fashion experiencing it, something intolerably big. Something from Brobdingag was pressing on her, was approaching, was almost in the room. She felt herself shrinking, suffocated, emptied of all power and virtue. And so the jovial influence, perhaps even Jove himself, is entering into the room. Whether this is actually Jove himself entering the room, or at least Jove exerting his influence through Ransom, who is serving as a bridge, which I think is probably more likely here. She is coming into this confrontation with Jove, with a jovial influence. And in response to the hugeness of Jove, she is simply undone. She felt herself shrinking. She's suffocated. She's emptied of all power and virtue. And she's starting to recognize that she is that. She is empty of all power and virtue. That she doesn't need to fill the world with herself. She needs herself to be filled with this higher reality. She needs to find herself in the hierarchy. She doesn't need to create herself. She doesn't need to assert herself. She needs to receive. Remember, as Ransom is told at the end of Paralandra, he lays no merit on you. Receive and be glad. That is exactly what she is starting to do. She is learning how to receive and to be glad. She is starting to learn this feminine role that she has to the masculine. She's going to receive. She is going to welcome. Now, at this point, as she's starting to just be even more undone, she looks to Ransom to kind of save her from this experience she's having, and Ransom pretty much just says, yeah, you should probably go at this point, because he doesn't want her to be utterly crushed. And so she leaves, she hops on the train, and she starts to reflect over her experience, not just over this conversation, but over everything. She starts to reflect over what life is. She reflects over what reality is, because she has been so broken. She has entered into the horror of emptiness that now she's learning what it means to be full. She's recognizing that reality itself is full. It is teeming with life. And so as we look at this next passage, rather long passage of her on the train, coming to see with new eyes, I want you to think in parallel with Ransom's reflections when, in Out of the Silent Planet, he first goes into what he initially called space and begins to recognize that space was the wrong name, because he starts to just get filled with the glory and beauty and luminosity of existence itself as it's pouring into him, unmediated in the heavens. We get something very similar here, because even though Jane is on Earth, physically speaking, she very much has been to the heavens through her interactions with Ransom, who serves as a conduit for these cosmic celestial realities. And so with celestial order pouring into her from Ransom, this is where she goes. This fourth and supreme Jane was simply the state of joy. The other three had no power upon her, for she was in the sphere of Jove, amid light and music and festal pomp, brimmed with life and radiant in health, jocund and clothed in shining garments. She thought scarcely of all the curious sensations which had immediately preceded the director's dismissal of her, and made that dismissal almost a relief. When she tried to, it immediately led her thoughts back to the director himself. Whatever she tried to think of led back to the director himself, and, in him, to joy. She saw from the windows of the train the outlined beams of sunlight pouring over stubble or burnished woods, and felt that they were like the notes of a trumpet. Her eyes rested on the rabbits and cows as they flitted by, and she embraced them in heart with merry holiday love. She delighted in the occasional speech of the one wizened old man who shared her compartment, and saw, as never before, the beauty of his shrewd and sunny old mind, sweet as a nut and English as a chalk-down. She reflected with surprise how long it was since music had played any part in her life, and resolved to listen to many chorals by Bach on the gramophone that evening. Or else, perhaps, she would read a great many Shakespearean sonnets. And so, again, this very much parallels Ransom's own revelation in the heavens, and even this language of light pouring on her, just as we saw with Ransom. And so this is her moment when she's starting to recognize that space is the wrong name, that reality itself is not as empty as she once thought. She's being awakened to glory. She's being awakened to the proper context that actually gives life meaning. And so in so doing, she's experiencing new joy of beauty, of truth, of goodness. And then this continues. She rejoiced also in her hunger and thirst, and decided that she would make herself buttered toast for tea, a great deal of buttered toast, and she rejoiced also in the consciousness of her own beauty, for she had the sensation, it may have been false in fact, but had nothing to do with vanity, that it was growing and expanding like a magic flower with every minute that passed. In such a mood, it was only natural, after the old countryman had got out at Curehardy, to stand up and look at herself in the mirror which confronted her on the wall of the compartment. Certainly she was looking well. She was looking unusually well. And once more, there was little vanity in this, for beauty was made for others. Her beauty belonged to the director. It belonged to him so completely that he could even decide not to keep it for himself, but to order that it be given to another, by an act of obedience lower, and therefore higher, more unconditional, and therefore more delighting, than if he had demanded it for himself. And so, through her right relationship And so through her experience of the ordering influence of Jove, she is becoming more herself in relation to Venus. She is embodying the feminine ideal. She is embodying beauty. Not the vain beauty that is self-referential, but the kind of beauty that recognizes its goal in giving itself away toward that which is higher so that it can serve as a conduit for truth and for goodness. And so that's what she wants to do. She wants to submit her beauty to the director, to Ransom, as he stands in the role of Jove. And then Jove, in his ordering role, directs her to give her beauty over to Mark. And so because she is submitting herself to the director, she is going to submit herself over to Mark. And in so doing, she is submitting herself to the director. And so we really get this dance of glory, of beauty, of submission, of obedience, of free will, of truth, of goodness, of harmony. And so this is all taking place. She is becoming more ordered in relation to Jove and in relation to Mars, or to Mark, who is, again, named after Mars. And so all of this cosmic order is finding its place in Jane. However, as Jane gets off the train, we get stark contrast. She moves back into the Silent Planet as Edgestowe is conquered by the NICE, as she is arrested by Hardcastle and her girls. And so hours later, bruised, frightened, and tired to death, Jane found herself in a street she did not even know, surrounded by NICE policemen and a few of their females, the Waipes. And so she's just gone from experiencing this great cosmic order to now being taken custody by Hardcastle and her Waipes. And so we get these distorted versions of the feminine are trying to conquer her. I mean, obviously, Fairy Hardcastle is not herself feminine at all, and the Waipes are, we're told earlier, they were like hyper-feminine to the point of imbecility, which means that they weren't actually feminine at all. They weren't instantiating the ideal. They were instantiating a superficial stereotype of the ideal. They were as feminine as Featherstone was masculine, which is not at all. It's all surface level stereotype type behavior. There's no substance there. I should also point out the name significance here. And so she's just moved away from Ransom, who is the successor of King Arthur, right? He is the Pendragon. He is the Fisher King. And now she is being taken captive by Fairy Hardcastle. Now, surely that name Fairy is meant to connect us to Morgan Le Fay, or Morgan of Fay, of Fairy. Morgan Le Fay, who was an enemy of her brother, King Arthur, and tried to kill him, in fact. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that she goes from Ransom, who is a stand-in for King Arthur, to then being attacked by Fairy Hardcastle, by Morgan Le Fay, who is trying to dismantle, trying to overthrow Loggers. And I think it's enough about this scene. I'm not going to get into all the different story elements. I mean, I'm sure you've read that yourself. But eventually she finds her way back to St. Anne's, where we get some more discussion of order. It said, "There are no servants here," said Mother Dimple, "and we all do the work. The women do it one day and the men the next." What? No, it's a very sensible arrangement. The director's idea is that men and women can't do housework together without quarreling. There's something in it. Of course, it doesn't do to look at the cups too closely on the men's day, but on the whole, we get along pretty well. And so we get this right relationship between the male and the female. They're all kind of doing the work. We see a harmony here. We see kind of order that is entirely missing from Bellbury, where we have the appearance of harmony, but everyone's ultimately out for themselves, trying to consume one another, just as we saw in the lowerarchy of hell in Screwtape. But here we see order. And Jane has a hard time getting her mind around this. She says, "I think what's puzzling me is that when I saw Ransom, he said something about equality not being the important thing, but his own house seems to be run on very democratic lines." And I think this can be explained by recognizing Lewis's idea that a kind of legal democracy, a kind of political democracy is often useful, maybe even necessary for keeping society together, but that democracy shouldn't move into the heart necessarily. It is a convention for maintaining political order, for maintaining civil order, but it doesn't mean that's what reality fundamentally is. Just as our clothes aren't ours by nature, but they do serve a purpose given the nature in which we currently find ourselves. Again, going to his essay Equality. "Hierarchy within can alone preserve egalitarianism without. Romantic attacks on democracy will come again. We shall never be safe unless we already understand in our hearts all that the anti-democrats can say, and have provided for it better than they. Human nature will not permanently endure flat equality if it is extended from its proper political field into the more real, more concrete fields within. Let us wear equality, but let us undress every night. And with that, let's go ahead and move to Mark at Bellbury as he starts to approach his interaction with the head of the NICE. Wither again tries to get Mark to bring Jane to Bellbury, and he thinks about what that would mean. He says that her mere presence would have made all the laughter of the inner ring sound metallic, unreal, and what he now regarded as common prudence would seem to her, and through her to himself, mere flattery, backbiting, and toad-eating. Jane in the middle of Bellbury would turn the whole of Bellbury into a vast vulgarity, flashy and yet furtive. And so at this point, Jane symbolizes for Mark the real, the substantial, that which gives him responsibility, the kind of responsibility he's been trying to flee from. Now, obviously, he's not going to recognize it yet in those terms, but that's exactly what it is. He knows that if Jane showed up, then all of this illusion that he's built up as to what his reality is would fall apart. And so at this point, he doesn't first and foremost want to keep Jane away for her own safety. That will come. But right now, he wants to keep Jane away because he knows that's going to dispel his illusion. And so he's living in a willful ignorance at this point. And he knows that Jane, her presence would not allow him to do that. And so he's out of favors with Wither at this point, and Philostrato recognizes this and strikes up a conversation with Mark. And Philostrato talks about how he wants to get rid of organic life, essentially, right? He wants to replace all the trees with these artificial trees, replace all the birds with artificial birds that you can turn on and off whenever you want to get rid of all of the filth, the organic life in the soil. He wants a completely sterile reality. Remember back at the beginning of the story when Featherstone is first talking to Mark about the NICE, and he says that they have a really good sanitation program. Well, that extended further than perhaps even Featherstone realized at the time. Philostrato literally wants to sterilize the earth. That's what all this is moving toward. I'm not going to read all of it, but this is when he starts to talk about the moon and this conflict going on at the moon and how there are these competing factions. And one of them, which seems to be winning, is doing just this. It's pursuing sterility. It's trying to get rid of organic life. They've got this weird avatar dating scenario that allows them to propagate their species without actually engaging in organic sexual intercourse. And so they're trying to divorce teleology from the organic. They're trying to separate themselves out from material bodily necessity. And so really they are pursuing a kind of Gnosticism, a kind of docetism. They're trying to negate the importance of the body. And remember, up to this point, especially in Paralandra, the importance that the incarnation had to play. In Maleldil entering into our existence as man, that shaped cosmic history. And Philostrato and the forces of the NICE are trying to undo that. They're trying to unwind the incarnation by dismissing the importance of the body. And I wish that we had more on this lunar conflict. Like maybe just a short story or something. Now, Lewis does actually have a short story regarding a trip to the moon, and if I can find that online, I'll go ahead and post that to the supplemental reading. But that's not directly related to this at all. It just might be interesting to take a look at. Okay, but let's go ahead and move past that particular conversation. And now we're moving into Philostrato and the NICE's Project for Immortality. At first, of course, said Philostrato, the power will be confined to a small number of individual men, those who were selected for eternal life. And you mean, said Mark, it will then be extended to all men. No, said Philostrato. I mean it will then be reduced to one man. You are not a fool, are you, my young friend? All that talk about the power of man over nature, man in the abstract, is only for the Canaglia. And I'm so sorry if I mispronounced that. You know as well as I do that man's power over nature means the power of some men over other men with nature as the instrument. There is no such thing as man. It is a word. There are only men. No, it is not man who will be omnipotent. It is some one man, some immortal man. And we see this directly described in The Abolition of Man, in which Lewis says that the movement of this technocracy that denies objective value, that denies anything like a true human nature, is necessarily going to lead to one person or a small group of people who have the means to exert by force their vision of reality on everybody else. This is going to be not the freedom of man as such. This is going to be the tyranny of one man or a small group of men who happen to have the technology, who happen to have the power to shape nature after their desires. This is going to be power held by one or a few magicians. Because remember, in this worldview, there is no virtue. There is no real use of reason because there is no idea of man as such. There is no human nature. What that means is there's nothing in common between us any more than there is between me and the organic material in the soil that we might want to extinguish. There is no man. There's no humanity. All we have are particular things with power that can exert that power over other particular things. That is the philosophy that we're talking about here. And this is what makes this anti-value scientism approach, this philosophy, so incredibly dangerous. Lewis, throughout this entire book, is giving us a warning. And that is that with all the talk of being progressive and liberating man from traditional values is the exact language that's going to lead us into tyranny, because it is this traditional values. It is natural law that secures freedom. Natural law that says that above any one person is this reason, is this virtue, is this set of ideals that demands that we act in a certain way. No man is king over the cosmos. Save one, of course, and our authority can never rise above his. And then we get that scene of the head by means of Jane's dream. Though Jane felt horror, even to the point of nausea, at the sight, in her dream, of Mark's real surroundings and associates, it had been horror that carried a certain grandeur and mystery with it. And so Mark's interactions with the head of the NICE take a very different form, very different direction than Jane's interactions with the head of St. Anne's. And so while Jane was consumed by glory and beauty and truth and this cosmic celestial influence, Mark is nearly brought to ruin and ends up passing out in horror and terror at what he was beholding. So he gets a sight into hell just as Jane got a sight into heaven. As David Downing says in Planets in Peril, Jane is filled with ineffable joy when she first meets the head of St. Anne's, the regal and mystical Ransom, returned from Perelandra. Mark is filled with unspeakable horror and revulsion when he meets the head of the NICE, a decapitated head supposedly kept alive by scientific apparatus, but actually animated by dark eldils. And that right there actually is not a bad summary of the abolition of man. Remember that first essay of the abolition of man is Men Without Chests. Well, you can't get a picture of that much more clearly than a decapitated head. A head, or a man of sorts, without a chest, who is apparently kept alive by a scientific apparatus or a scientific ideology, but is actually animated by dark eldils, by forces that are beyond his control. And so this description right here very much pairs up with what I was talking about in the video on the abolition of man, that the worldview of science, that the so-called philosophy of science is being led by forces that it cannot account for, and perhaps we might even call these dark eldils. And in response to this horror, well, this is when Mark starts to become undone. We're told that Jane was undone in response to glory and beauty and truth and goodness. Well, Mark is going to be undone in the face of despair. He's going to recognize the nothingness that he has been pursuing. And that also can be a powerful motivation to discovering the right, as it certainly will be as we continue to follow Mark's story through these chapters and beyond. And so at first Mark thinks, okay, maybe this experience with this head was just a dream. But he knew it was true, and he could not, as they say, take it. He was very ashamed of this, for he wished to be considered one of the tough ones. But the truth is that his toughness was only of the will, not of the nerves, and the virtues he had almost succeeded in banishing from his mind still lived, if only negatively, in his weaknesses in his body. He approved of vivisection, but had never worked in a dissecting room. He recommended that certain classes of people should be gradually eliminated, but he had never been there when a small shopkeeper went to the workhouse, or a starved old woman of the governess type came to the very last day and hour and minute in the cold attic. He knew nothing about the last half cup of cocoa, drunk slowly 10 days before. And so in this section, Mark is going to increasingly become aware of the fact that he is empty, that he is indeed a man without a chest. He is led by empty abstractions, but he has no virtue, he has no substance. He is but a shadow, a shade, a ghost of a man. But he still has not yet begun to grasp for substance. And so at this point he decides he needs to go get Jane just to save his own life. His mind had made this decision for him at some moment he did not remember. He must get her to save his life. All his anxieties about being in the inner ring or getting a job had shrunk into insignificance. It was a question of life or death. And so on one hand, it's good that he's being confronted with the question of life and death, because that is something that we cannot escape. We cannot escape our mortality once it presents itself to us, at least not for very long. And so this is forcing him to make a decision. Now, he's making the wrong decision, but at least he is making a decision. And that separates him out from the path that he's been on this far, where he has been very much not making decisions. He has just been pulled along for the ride by those around him. He's been taking the shape of his environment. Well, now he's finally making a decision. And even though this is the wrong decision, it's still a decision nonetheless. And that is an important pathway toward manifesting the martial influence. I think of Kierkegaard, who makes this point, that the worst thing you can do is remain indifferent. You come to a fork in the road. You can either spend your entire life standing there figuring out which way to go, or you can just pick a direction and start walking. And maybe you'll pick the right direction, but even if you pick the wrong direction, then once you walk down it for a bit, you'll recognize that you're not in the place that you want to be. And once you recognize the wrong road, well, then you have a better perspective for recognizing the right road. And so sometimes the best thing you can do is just make a decision, get some conviction, and move. And maybe you make the wrong choice, but at least that gives you a better chance of making the right choice. And so this here is an important step in him becoming an actual self, becoming a responsible agent. Even though he's being driven by fear, even though this is the wrong choice, it is the beginning of choice making. And that itself is a good thing. It's a movement toward an integrated, responsible self. But he still has a long way to go on that road. It must be remembered that in Mark's mind, hardly one rag of noble thought, either Christian or pagan, had a secure lodging. His education had been neither scientific nor classical, merely modern. The severities both of abstraction and of high human tradition had passed him by, and he had neither peasant shrewdness nor aristocratic honor to help him. He was a man of straw, a glib examinee in subjects that required no exact knowledge. He had always done well on essays and general papers, and the first hint of a real threat to his bodily life knocked him sprawling. Working in academia, working in higher education, working with a lot of postmodern indoctrinated students, this whole section really hits home, where Mark has spent his whole life in abstraction. He has spent his whole life in a modern education that is entirely lacking of virtue, entirely lacking of strength, whether Christian or pagan. Everything is this confusing fog of witherspeak, of things that sound nice but don't really have any substance, of abstract scientific inquiry but no instantiation of actual relationships to the world around him. And so his mortality presenting itself is knocking him sprawling. And actually, even just as I'm saying this, I'm going to include something in the supplemental reading that is not directly related to Lewis, but is very thematically related to Mark's responses to his relationship to death. And that is Tolstoy's short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which I actually teach in my on-campus life, death, and meaning class. And so I'm going to see if I can find a copy online. I'm sure I can somewhere. But that's actually a book that I would recommend picking up paperback. That's worth having in your collection. Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is all about the death of Ivan Ilyich. This is somebody who has never really taken his life seriously. He's always lived just superficially, doing the things that people of society do, very much following Mark's trajectory up to this point. But eventually he gets this illness and becomes increasingly clear that this is going to be the death of him. And he has all these struggles and denials, but eventually he comes to accept the fact that he's going to die. And it is that concrete, inescapable reality that allows him to become an integrated self. It allows him to form the correct internal and external relationships so that when he does come to death, he's able to do it well. That this person who has lacked a chest, he's lacked a heart, he's lacked virtue, he's lacked substance his entire life, is able to find it before the end. And so I think that with Mark's journey here, especially in these chapters, the death of Ivan Ilyich makes a pretty powerful companion. And so again, I'm going to try to find that online and put that in the supplemental reading for you. But now, as he's going through this reflection, he's starting to recognize how incredibly weak he is. He's starting to get some strength. He's being emptied out here so that he can be built again. In recognizing his emptiness, he's starting to recognize that he needs to be filled. He's starting to grasp for substance. And this is when he starts to show real concern for Jane. Formless fear stirred in his mind. And Jane of all people, would they take her to the head? For almost the first time in his life, a gleam of something like disinterested love came into his mind. He wished he had never married her, never dragged her into this whole outfit of horrors, which was apparently to be his life. And so he actually is starting to show some love for her that is distinct from what he gets out of it. He is starting to give himself over in love, and that is an important beginning point of his growth into who he's meant to be, growth into substance. He is learning the right kind of obedience to higher authorities. And so he decides he's just going to run off and he's going to find Jane. But he doesn't get very far. There was a figure before him on the path, a tall, very tall, slightly stooping figure, sauntering and humming a little dreary tune, the deputy director himself. And in one moment, all that brittle hardihood was gone from Mark's mood. He turned back. He stood in the road. This seemed to him the worst pain that he has ever felt. Then, tired, so tired, that he felt the weak tears filling his eyes, he walked very slowly back into Belbury. And so as we've seen from the beginning of his interactions with Belbury, the deputy director, Wither, really just haunts the entire land here. And so Mark just fled from him, but now he sees him again in the outskirts of the land. He's always just humming around. He seems to always be present anywhere he goes in Belbury. The entire institution is really just consumed by the presence of the director. And this makes me think of Screwtape. With beasts, the absorption takes the form of eating. For us, it means the sucking of will and freedom out of a weaker self into a stronger. And this is what we see here. That in this moment, Mark's will is being consumed by Wither, and perhaps more importantly, by the powers at play in Wither, by the demonic influence that are walking across the bridge that is Wither. And so they are consuming his will, consuming his sense of freedom. And that's exactly what we see here. But eventually Mark does get out and about, and he comes into an interaction with Dimble. And I love this conversation, because what we see here is a man of substance, Dimble, asserting himself against the emptiness of Mark. He is making Mark come to terms with who he is, simply by asserting himself. And so he has this penetrating insight, just as Ransom did not allow Jane to bring up these artificial excuses and images of reasoning. So too, Dimble is not going to let Mark say anything half-hearted. He's not going to let him put out the fog treatment here in this conversation. He's not going to let him play Wither. He's not going to let him use imprecise language. He is going to assert himself with substance, and he is going to demand substance from Mark. And in context, Dimble told Mark what Hardcastle did to Jane, and Mark says, well, I'm going to really do her in for this one. And Dimble's not going to have any of that. Suddenly, the immobility of Dimble's face changed, and he spoke in a new voice. Have you the means to bring her to book? He said. Are you already as near the center of Belbury as that? If so, then you have consented to the murder of Hingist, the murder of Compton. If so, it was by your orders that Mary Prescott was raped and battered to death in the sheds behind the station. It is with your approval that criminals, honest criminals whose hands you are unfit to touch, are being taken from the jails to which British judges sent them on the conviction of British juries and packed off to Belbury to undergo for an indefinite period, out of reach of the law, whatever tortures and assaults on personal identity you call remedial treatment. By the way, I'm also going to include in the supplemental reading an essay that deals with this idea of remedial treatment. It is you who have driven 2,000 families from their homes to die of exposure in every ditch from here to Birmingham or Worcester. It is you who can tell us why Place and Rowley and Cunningham, at 80 years of age, have been arrested, and where they are. And if you are as deeply in as that, not only will I not deliver Jane into your hands, but I would not deliver my dog. And this is an important moment, because in many ways, Mark, at least for a long time, has not had an interaction with a real person of substance, who could see things clearly and who could demand responsibility. But this is what's happening here, and it's going to throw Mark off. It may seem strange to say that Mark, having long lived in a world without charity, had nevertheless very seldom met real anger. And remember, anger, hatred, has a legitimate place, as we saw in Paralandra. Malice in plenty he had encountered, but it all operated by snubs and sneers and stabbing in the back. The forehead and eyes and voice of this elderly man had an effect on him which was stifling and unnerving. At Belbury, one used the words whining and yapping to describe any opposition which the action to Belbury aroused in the outer world. And Mark had never had enough imagination to realize what the whining would really look like if he met it face to face. And so Mark is learning what substance look like. His illusion is being dispelled as he comes to terms with somebody who is actually grounded. But not only does Dimble demonstrate the right kind of anger connected with the right kind of insight, but he also demonstrates a kind of grace that Mark is entirely unfamiliar with. Nevertheless, continued Dimble, knowing all this, knowing that you may be only bait in the trap, I will take a risk. I will risk things compared with which both our lives are a triviality. If you seriously wish to leave the NICE, I will help you. One moment, it was like the gate to paradise opening. Then, at once, caution, and the incurable wish to temporize, rushed back. The chink had closed again. I need to think that over, he mumbled. There is no time, said Dimble, and there is really nothing to think about. I am offering you a way back into the human family, but you must come at once. It's a question affecting my whole future career. Your career, said Dimble. It's a question of damnation, or a last chance, but you must come at once. And this is the kind of passage where if you really experience it, if you're looking along the beam, I feel like it should bring tears in your eyes. At the very least, it should put a sting in your heart. The fact that Dimble is quite literally inviting Mark back into the human family, despite the fact that Mark has, up to this point, chosen a home of demons. But he must come at once. But Mark doesn't want to be taken in. He's not willing to sacrifice everything that he's made up to this point. He's not willing to sacrifice his career. He's holding on to all these temporal, artificial, superficial matters instead of entering into the gates of the kingdom. And Lewis does such a great job with this imagery here that given this invitation, the opportunity of leaving Belbury, Mark sees the gates of paradise opening. He knows that this is the right choice. He sees glory and beauty here, but it is beyond his reach at the moment because he is consumed with caution. He is not willing to assert himself. This whole scene here, as Mark is really just unnerved and he is undone in the presence of real substance, makes you think of this line from Till We Have Faces, which we'll get to in more detail when we actually get to that book. But Psyche says, "Don't you think a dream would feel shy if it were seen walking about in the waking world?" Mark here, he is a dream in presence of reality. He is the lesser in the presence of the greater. And unlike what we're going to see with Psyche, Mark doesn't embrace this relationship as he ought to. He doesn't distinctly recognize the hierarchy, and as such seeks to bring everything down to his level, which means, despite his language of progression, there is nowhere for him to progress yet at this moment. He doesn't yet have eyes to see the upward path. And then Jane and company go out to look for Merlin, and they start to experience history. They start to experience the reality of the Dark Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, coming into present reality. And so, again, we get this confrontation with not just the idea of history, but the presence of history as such, and everything that it entails regarding basic history, but also mythologically speaking. We get this union of all kinds of ideas that are usually left to abstraction and scholarly interest. In fact, we're even told of Dimble. And suddenly, all that Britain, which had been so long familiar to Dimble as a scholar, rose up like a solid thing. And so just as Mark came into relationship with greater substance through Dimble, so too Dimble is brought into relationship with a greater substance himself. He has spent his life as a scholar studying about things, but now he's entering into the thing itself. Just as Ransom was initially an academic philologist who worked with words, but eventually came to live in the realities themselves. Well, Dimble also is starting to experience that. In fact, Jane will as well. And I won't read all this. You can download the PowerPoint, take a look at it yourself for what I'm highlighting. But this is an important passage. And so at this point, things are starting to become real to her. And so up to this point, she had believed what the director said about Mileldil and the Oyarsu and the Eldila and all this stuff. But now it's starting to become real. She's starting to develop a direct relationship with these realities. And she's starting to recognize that there may be a connection between these realities and the religion that she once knew, and the religion that she's seen practice in people like Mrs. Dimble saying her prayers. But these things just seem more real. They seem different than the superficial, domesticated religion that she's known. And so, as David Downing says, on Malacandra, Ransom had gradually come to realize that Mileldil was the same person as the god he already believed in. In That Hideous Strength, Jane makes the even more startling discovery that Meledil is the god she had not believed in. And so just as we're starting to see in Mark, we see more fully, more directly, more progressively that Jane is coming into relationship with the greater substance. She is learning to look along the light and to live in the things themselves. All right, so now we go back to Bellbury. At this point, Mark is imprisoned, and Wither and Frost are talking about what to do here. And Wither says, "You need not doubt that I would open my arms to receive, to absorb, to assimilate this young man." So again, we get the Screwtape language of the demonic desire to consume, to absorb, and so that's what's going on here. And then we get this really weird, creepy scene in which Frost and Wither kind of absorb each other, or maybe they're absorbed together into a greater macrobian demonic reality. And so they increasingly move together, and then they embrace each other. And then it says that they each seem to be struggling to escape. And so this is not a beatific experience. They're being pulled together. They're being absorbed, being consumed by some demonic connection that they both share here, which again speaks to this absorption, Screwtapian mentality here. All right, now we go back to Mark coming into confrontation with his mortality and the reflections that he's having here. And so he had never till now been at close quarters with death. Now glancing down at his hand, because his hands were cold and he'd been automatically rubbing them, it came to him as a totally new idea that this very hand, with its 5 nails and the yellow tobacco stain on the inside of the second finger, would one day be the hand of a corpse, and later the hand of a skeleton. He did not exactly feel horror, though on the physical level he was aware of a choking sensation. What made his brain reel was the preposterousness of the idea. This was something incredible, yet at the same time quite certain. So Mark is somebody who's never really thought about his mortality. He's never really thought about death, but as he's starting to do so, it's bringing his attention to focus. And this is going to be an important part of him becoming more intentional about the way that he's living and recognizing the fact that he is going to die. Which, again, I think is going to lead to some significant parallels with the death of Ivan Ilyich. And so please, if you have not read it, do yourself a favor and make sure that you read that story. And so he starts to reflect back on his life, on the fact that he's always been striving for an inner circle, and that's always been such an important part of his identity. But now he's looking back and recognizing how empty it all was, that he was always looking for the center, but he was never finding it. He was only finding more circles and more emptiness. Was there no beginning to his folly? Had he been utter fool all through from the very day of his birth? And so he's looking back, recognizing his whole life up to this point had been a sham. He himself did not understand why all this, which was now so clear, had never previously crossed his mind. He was unaware that such thoughts had often knocked for entrance, but had always been excluded for the very reason that if they were once entertained, it involved ripping up the whole web of his life, canceling almost every decision his will had ever made, and really beginning over again as though he were an infinite. The indistinct massive problems which would have to be faced if he admitted such thoughts, the innumerable somethings about which something would have to be done, had deterred him from ever raising these questions. What had now taken the blinkers off was the fact that nothing could be done. And so he's entering into despair of his own ability, despair of his own ability to manufacture his life from the ground up. Kierkegaard talks a lot about this, that in order to gain real freedom, to embrace the reality of grace, to embrace the reality of nature, such as our natural design in the image of God, that part of our ability to make that kind of decision is to despair over our own ability to create ourselves out of nothing. And so if we are going to find rest, sometimes you have to recognize how restless your heart is in order to see more clearly that in which our hearts might rest. As Augustine says, "You have made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." And so Mark is starting to enter into the despair of his own restlessness and his inability to create his own rest. And that's going to play an important role in helping him to recognize the real as it continues to present himself to him, even if at this point through an inverse relation, as he looks into emptiness, as he looks into the void. And so really what he's doing is he's starting to erase his life and become an infant. We talked about before how earlier in the story, Jane starts to take a childlike role in her desire for genuine maturity, whereas Mark took a childish role in his continued immaturity. Well, now he's finally becoming a child in the right kind of way, orienting himself away from himself toward reality, toward growth in nature, growth toward his destiny. He is ready to learn. And then he just continues with these reflections. And again, you can read this on the PowerPoint, but he's just continuing through the same line of thought. But I do want to read this passage. This is another one that I think is just wonderful. A great commentary on our present age. In his normal condition, explanations that laid on impersonal forces outside himself the responsibility for all his life of dust and broken bottles would have occurred at once to his mind and been at once accepted. It would have been the system, or an inferiority complex due to his parents, or the peculiarities of the age. None of these things occurred to him now. His scientific outlook had never been a real philosophy, believed with blood and heart. It had lived only in his brain, and was a part of the public self which was now falling off him. He was aware, without even having to think of it, that it was he himself, nothing else in the whole universe, that had chosen the dust and broken bottles, the heap of old tin cans, the dry and choking places. And so he's no longer seeing himself with empty abstract ideologies. He is no longer seeing himself simply as the product of his environment, the product of his system. Keep in mind that by trade, he is a sociologist, which, and this is what sociologists do all the time. In large part, this story is the story of Marx's redemption from sociology, the redemption from this idea that systems and societies create people. No, obviously these things have an influence, but ultimately the individual decides how they relate to these influences, whether they go down the stream as Marx did for much of the story up to this point, or whether they take a stand and move against them. People always are responsible for establishing the relationships that they have to the world around them. And Marx is starting to recognize that it was he and not society that chose for himself the dust and the broken bottles, the heap of old tin cans, the dry and choking places. So Marx is moving into greater and greater degrees of personal responsibility, which is a very important part of his relationship to the martial spirit, as well as his integration as an authentic individual human self. As we move in this direction, my Kierkegaardian passions are starting to rise up here. But I actually want to quote another existentialist here from what I think is a great existentialist novel, The Flight to Arras, in which is written, "I reject non-being. My purpose is to be, and if I am to be, I must begin by assuming responsibility. This is the beginning of the appropriation of substance." Mark is starting to learn how to assert himself in the right way. He is starting to embody the martial influence. And as he does so, his relationship to Jane is going to become more clear in this heartbreaking reflection here. She seemed to him, as he now thought of her, to have in herself deep wells and knee-deep meadows of happiness, rivers of freshness, enchanted gardens of leisure, which he could not enter, but could have spoiled. She was one of those other people, like Pearson, like Denison, like the Dimples, who could enjoy things for their own sake. She was not like him. It was well that she should be rid of him. And so even though he's not yet ready to assert himself in the right way that's going to work for the good of Jane, I mean, keep in mind, he thinks he's about to die, and so we gotta cut him some slack on that. He's starting to recognize Jane as this avenue of beauty that he had an obligation to protect, to guard, not to usurp, not to dominate, not to use for his own selfish ambitions or progression through society, but he had an obligation to defend her, to lay himself down for her and to secure her virtue, as Ransom did for the Green Lady on Paralandra, and by extension, as Mars did for Venus. That's what the masculine does. It uses its strength in humble, sacrificial service for the good of the feminine, that her virtue might be secured and amplified. Mark's responsibility was not to subdue, or worse yet, to consume the garden, but to cultivate it, to work it, to help it to be more itself. And now, even though he thinks it's too late, he is starting to develop this right relationship. He is starting to find the right order. And we will see how this progresses in the final chapters. Until next time, Godspeed. Alright, thank you for listening, and thank you for your support if you support us over on Patreon. If you don't support us, well, thank you for listening, and thank you for your support that way. If you're not looking to support us financially right now, then I encourage you to share this around, and of course give us a 5-star review, maybe a positive comment over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever else you can do that. But I do encourage you to become a paid patron over at patreon.com/mythicmind. Even $5 of support gives you that Discord access, all the podcasts early and ad-free. And if you become an annual Tier 3 patron, then you also get access to any of my courses that begin within your term. If you sign on soon, then that would include the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy, the Silmarillion, the Psychology of Soren Kierkegaard, and maybe one more. We'll see. But definitely those three. So again, that's for annual Tier 3 patrons, or you can purchase individual courses if that's what you want to do. Now, I do want to thank all of my patrons. Right now, we're up to over 70 paid patrons on some level or another. But by name, I would like to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher. So many thanks to Mark, Aaron, Amanda, Andrew, Chase, Chaz, Christopher Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Adam, Jack, Jamie, Justin, Kit, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. All of you just really go above and beyond in helping to fund things like this and all the new ways that we are branching out. And so I appreciate your support over there, and I hope that if you don't already support us, that you would consider doing so. All right, well, that's it for now. The next thing to come out from Mythic Mind in the public feed will be, over on Mythic Mind Movies and Shows on Wednesday as we continue with the Star Wars series, this time for better or worse, moving into the sequel trilogy. But that's it for now. Until next time, Godspeed. The Elder Scrolls and Philosophy, a new course beginning in October, led by Dr. Andrew Snyder. I played a lot of video games in my youth, perhaps more than I should have. But as I got older, got married, had kids, and completed a PhD on the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, I almost entirely stopped playing games. However, there were certain titles that stayed with me during this time, at the very least in my mind. In fact, looking back, I now realize that most games of my youth were not entirely frivolous, but they instead served quasi-literary roles, fueling my imagination, intellectual curiosity, and my appreciation for wonder. Chief among these titles are the mainline games of the Elder Scrolls, and in particular Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim. And I know that I am not alone in this, as the wild success of the recent Oblivion remaster would indicate. Now, in addition to teaching university courses in philosophy and religion, I've also started offering independent courses to anyone who wants to come along with me and with the community in pursuit of wisdom through primary and secondary worlds. So far, these independent courses have been literature-based, such as The Fiction and Philosophy of C.S. Lewis, Life, Death, and Meaning with Beowulf and Boethius, The Lord of the Rings, A Brief History of Ideas, and Plato's Stoicism and Till We Have Faces. However, I've recently been leading the Mythic Mind Fellowship into popular media as well, such as movies and games, and it did not take me many steps in this direction to decide that I wanted to do something with the Elder Scrolls. During this 6-week study of the philosophy of the Elder Scrolls, we're going to go deep into various aspects of Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim to better understand the driving forces of the sub-created world and our movements within it. Among others, we'll be asking questions like, what is the creation mythos of the Elder Scrolls, and how does this relate to primary world ideas? What are the 36 lessons of Vivek, and where do they direct us? What is unique about the hero of Kvatch's particular kind of heroism? What does the Oblivion Crisis reveal about the nature of evil in relation to societal institutions? Why are dragons so prolific in our fantastical imaginations? What unique opportunities for existential exploration are made available in open-world games? Join this community as we enter Tamriel with the purpose of learning more about our place within our own world. Each week will include ongoing Discord conversations, at least 1 or 2 asynchronous videos to watch whenever you want to, and live discussions, which will be recorded and made available if you're not able to participate. You can purchase enrollment in the shop over at patreon.com/mythicmind, or become a Tier 3 annual patron to get access to all courses that begin within your yearly term. This course begins in October, so go ahead and make it happen. And I hope to see you there.